Okay, so it's 2 minutes after 2. I think that's the right time to start this session. We are also recording the session, so those who will join later will have the opportunity to watch the beginning. So again, thank you everyone for joining today's session. My name is Klara Jordan. I'm the Chief Public Policy Officer at the CyberPeace Institute. Just a couple of quick housekeeping rules and a brief introduction. The session today is on the record and is being recorded. For those who cannot attend, it will be posted on our website. Also, if you would like to contact any of the speakers or other participants that are here today, please let us know. We'd be happy to facilitate the connection. I will start just very briefly introducing the Institute and just placing a bit of it in the context of today's conversation. At the CyberPeace Institute, we focus on limiting harms to individuals from the use of ICTs by the way of conducting collective analysis of attacks, assisting vulnerable communities, and making a coordinated efforts towards accountability of perpetrators. We believe that the space we're all using should be safe, secure, and at peace, and access to it should be available to everyone. And so really in line with this mission, we believe that the individuals, the humans, and the impact of cyber attacks on them should be at the core of the policymaking and decision-making, both in the political and policy communities, but also by those who have the power to make choices about the impact on humans via technology they create, operate, and manage. So the reason why we are doing this workshop is we believe that the community you represent here today, journalists, researchers, academics, and decision makers, can impact how those who make decisions about our collective future will think about cybersecurity and will think about the humans at the end of those decisions. We have seen really positive trends in reporting. I think there is a much more focus on the human impact of different cyber incidents, but we want to encourage the continuation of this positive trend. We also think that journalists are a key to resilience of democratic society, and so their cyber resilience should be at heart of our efforts, and that's why we join with our partners today, who will talk about how these communities can increase their resilience. We will hear just in a minute much more about that importance of reporting for policymakers. So let me introduce the president of the CyberPeace Institute, Marietje Schaake, who will open the session by talking about the decision makers' perspective on this issue. Marietje serves as the president, but also as the International Policy Director at Stanford University Cyber Policy Center. And she's International Policy Fellow at Stanford Institute for Human-centric Artificial Intelligence. She served as the member of European Parliament for the Dutch Liberal Democratic Party, and she focused on trade, foreign affairs, and technology policies. She's affiliated with a number of not-for-profits and is also a regular contributor to the Financial Times and to the Dutch newspaper. She has spent a lot of her time and effort speaking about these issues publicly. So we're very pleased that she accepted the invitation today to share her perspective with you. Over to you, Marietje.
Thank you so much, Klara, and really the entire team who have behind the scenes organized this session so well today. So really appreciate it. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to warmly welcome you to this workshop of the CyberPeace Institute. And the aim is to give you all, we have representatives of the media, of government, civil society, and academia, a much better sense of the ins and outs of cyber attacks. I'm really excited that you're all with us and that we welcome people from all corners of the world. At the CyberPeace Institute, we have a mission to focus very much on the human side or the victims of cyber attacks and to make sure that they do not have to suffer. We see people in human rights organizations, civil society organizations broadly, but also in journalism, increasingly being targeted or ending up as so-called collateral damage as the result of the increase in the number and the intensity of cyber attacks. And at CPI, we're very keen to make sure that there is evidence and data publicly available about the methods, the actors, the trends, the approaches that we see used by perpetrators a lot of this information currently ends up being held privately, could be by governments that are doing intelligence gathering, risk analysis, but also cybersecurity firms that offer risk analysis or the monitoring of intrusions, but that are not as keen to share this information publicly. But we believe that having a better sense of the facts and the impact will hit home when it comes to the understanding of what the price of cyber attacks really is, and of course, how to solve for the harms. We believe in prevention, increasing resilience, but also ensuring that there is accountability for the perpetrators after attacks will inevitably take place. Now, as a former policymaker myself, Klara mentioned, I served in the European Parliament for 10 years, and I've looked intensely at the mechanisms of how change comes about, what kinds of consensus there needs to be, and how the processes of the legislation take place. I'm really convinced that any type of pressure or support for politicians to act depends a lot on the sense of urgency that is felt throughout society. So as long as reporting about cyber attacks is about terabytes compromised or millions of dollars stolen, it remains a relatively abstract story for people in society. Someone like my mom, for example, would not imagine that cyber attacks impact her life. On the other hand, when we think of pictures of people in line for gas, remember when the Colonial Pipeline hack impacted physical infrastructure and the availability of fuel at petrol stations on the American East Coast, those pictures with people trying to bring jerry cans and plastic bags are etched in our memory. Or for people in the Netherlands, where I currently am, we all recall empty shelves where sliced and cut cheese was normally stacked in the supermarkets when a dairy transporter encountered delays in delivering to grocery stores, all because of a ransomware attack. Now, of course, these are telling, but also thankfully not deadly or otherwise harmful impacts. Worse still is that we've seen that patients have been turned away from hospitals that were attacked. We know that there's a huge targeting of labs, of organizations and hospitals that are trying to produce the vaccine and other solutions for the pandemic. Or, as Ben Hubbard, a journalist of the New York Times, said yesterday, in a world where we store so much of our professional lives in the devices we carry in our pockets, and where surveillance software continues to become ever more sophisticated, we are all increasingly vulnerable. Now, it turns out that Ben's phone, as a journalist, was hacked with the help of Pegasus, which is NSO Group's hacking service. You may have heard about the Pegasus project and all the harms that this surveillance and hacking software has. So at the CyberPeace Institute, it's important for us to help people, to help you understand the data, the human side. And today we will offer an introduction to the kind of work we do, the research we have already done and continue to do, the analysis of cyber attacks and the ways in which they take place, and the types of reports that we have. And we hope it will be of value to you so that you can be a part of our mission of sharing what is happening, the sense of urgency to create that awareness throughout society, to protect the most vulnerable people, but of course to make sure that there's change on the political and international legal level, and that there is accountability so that perpetrators cannot go on unpunished. With that, I'm happy to pass back the floor, and I really look forward to the session today. Welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Marietje. And now we're going to move on to the rest of the interventions from the CyberPeace Institute. And then at the top of the hour, before we move to the cyber hygiene training, I will introduce the speakers who will do that portion of the session today. So now we're going to move to two of my colleagues, to Roxana, Radu, and Bernhard Schneider. So Roxana is the research associate who has worked for the Geneva Internet Platform, Diplo Foundation, Internet Society, and has held several postdoctoral research positions. I have the pleasure to work with Roxana every day. She will talk about how we can contextualize these attacks into international law framework. We also have my colleague Bernhard Schneider, who is a cyber data analyst at the Institute. He will cover more of the technical elements of the reporting. And before joining the Institute, he has held several research and analyst positions on cyber and counterterrorism issues. Before I turn over to Roxana, there's very little I can add to what Marietje said about why we think that there's an important of changing the way we are thinking and reporting on cybersecurity. And for really it's about shaping the mindset of understanding of those who make these decisions, that at the end of the decision-making process about the law or regulation or holding someone accountable for their action is actually the human, and that those decisions impact human life. We know that cybersecurity is complex and sometimes very hard to grasp, and I commend all of you for your efforts to shed the light on these issues, because it's a very much needed work in this area. It was all already mentioned, but I really want to stress that unless we report on and understand the societal impact of cyber attacks, our focus will continue to be on national security, foreign policy, and financial equities, and not on the human impact. And what I think and what we think in our work is, this will ultimately, lead to policies that will fail to produce that safe and secure cyberspace. We all know that the state and non-state actors in this space have certain responsibilities and obligations toward individuals, and many of these obligations are rooted in international law. And the state intentions for this space are expressed via norms of responsible state behavior in cyberspace. However, the value of the rules and the norms comes from operationalizing it. A lot of times these can seem very esoteric and remove from the reality, but really, in fact, these rules and norms are essence of the obligations of the state to create a certain space for their citizens, for the exercise of their individual and human rights. So we think it's absolutely important to recall those obligations of state, that when we talk about cyber attacks, we talk about what norms might have been violated, what action or what action or mission led to a certain cyber attacks. And we think, that is also the work that we are looking forward to seeing more in the reporting. So we understand who had what responsibility towards whom in this space. So I will now turn over to my colleague Roxana, who will cover a bit more on that. And when she is done with her part, we'll turn to Bernhard for the technical part of the issues. Roxana, over to you.
Thank you, Klara. Good afternoon, everyone. I'll start by zooming in a little bit on the individual and collective harms inflicted by ransomware, and then on some of the contributions that are needed from all of us in order to change the situation. So it's not just the bleak picture of what is happening, but also some of the ways forward that I hope we can all agree to work towards in the near future. When ransomware attacks occur, targets and victims are very often conflated, and this is a little bit part of the problem we're seeing nowadays. It is important to point out the entire chain of harms, from the entity being attacked as a direct target to the person at the end of the spectrum that has their personal data dumped online and their life completely disrupted. Organizations, both public and private, are slowed down when such attacks happen, but individuals might be completely and permanently destabilized by incidents of this type. If we take the very recent examples of local authorities coming under attack in Switzerland, in Hol or Montreux, or the Vastamo psychotherapy clinic attack in Finland, we see that some or even the entirety of personal data might remain forever compromised. That includes unique identification numbers on official documents, social security numbers that cannot be changed following an attack. In Finland, there was a petition to exceptionally allow victims of the Vastaamo attack to change their social security numbers so that they are a little bit more protected from cyber criminals. But as far as I know, this is still underway. But in many other countries, we don't even have a discussion around this. Most public administrations do not look at the cyber crime and cyber attacks issue as something that will trigger legislative change immediately in order to protect these victims. And the range of remedies available to victims is really minimal. The burden of administrative procedures is entirely placed on the victim. And of course, this creates additional problems because somebody who has been a victim of a ransomware attack, has suffered the threat of their data being dumped online, and has already been in a rather traumatic situation, is asked to go through a number of procedures to change personal information so that attackers no longer follow them. It's extremely unbalanced as a situation, what we have now. And even if you think of less problematic data being dumped online, like a postal address, well, even that is very difficult to change. We do not change houses every day, and that might be used for criminal purposes in conjunction with other personal information that might be available about the person, sometimes voluntarily disclosed. But imagine somebody who is in that position of having a bank loan added to their name just because some of their data was available online. So ransomware has multiple trickle-down effects, but we need to think about what that means long-term for the victims and not just for the targets themselves. The true cost of ransomware is also about the psychological impact of living with the fear that your world could crumble at any point and your personal information can be misused very easily. At a societal level, it's disheartening and even traumatizing to see that level of harm and that level of impunity that continue to remain unchecked. When it comes to ransomware attacks on supply chains, and we've seen a recent example of this with the Kaseya attack, collective harms are inflicted alongside personal harms, and these generally go underreported. In the Kaseya attack, we saw 1,500 businesses around the world being affected in what was designated as the largest ransomware attack that ended up blocking supermarkets, pharmaceuticals, schools. So the entire food supply chain fell victim to this in certain countries, and also essential services. The attack had widespread and indiscriminate impact on direct clients, but also on users outside of the client's control because the software was sold by third parties. And whereas it took Kaseya 19 days to get the decryption key, other entities were impacted for much longer, and the disruption of services continued for months. And this leads to a general loss of trust in our basic capabilities, in our networks that we use every day. And that at the societal level, this is quite problematic. But are we completely powerless in front of such attacks? What are some of the long-term solutions that we can work towards? I'd like to offer 3 reflections based on our work at the CyberPeace Institute. The first one concerns the collection of data. Unfortunately, we know ransomware incidents go unreported, but even when they are reported, the frameworks we have to collect the relevant data are not at all human-centric. It's a lot about the targets and less about the victims, and it's scattered information, very difficult to find. There's no repository that is easily accessible, and it doesn't necessarily link back to the victims' opportunities to take action. So just reporting doesn't necessarily encourage action, and that is not a motivating factor. Victims are a bit discouraged from doing yet another administrative form if they don't necessarily see the benefit of how that might lead to remedies for them. Second, we need to be able to link the description of the incidents and the technical analysis to normative and legal instruments that foster accountability. We have extensive technical analysis available in the aftermath of cyber attacks, but we need that to feed into a larger process of accountability and information sharing so that better assistance measure can be put in place. And relatedly, we need to better understand and explicitly address the gaps in accountability in order to reduce impunity. The untold part of the story is that ransomware doesn't end with the decryption key being made available or a backup being implemented to restore the system. Once the technical investigation is over, international agreed norms of responsible behavior, existing laws, existing regulations need to be invoked and applied to all ransomware cases. To reduce impunity, we need these legal obligations to be explicitly mentioned, and we need to hold perpetrators and also our own government sometimes accountable for all these breaches. We see that the legal discussion is more complicated to navigate because there are different bodies of law that might apply, from domestic and criminal legislation all the way up to international law and due diligence obligations and human rights protections of individuals. But as long as we keep this as a black box, we're not able to overcome the situation. So explicitly reflecting on some of the violations and having the legal side of the story presented alongside the technical analysis and the economic analysis is extremely important to change the situation. Thank you. I will stop here for the time being, but happy to pick up on whatever is interesting for you to develop further on.
Thank you, Roxana. I just want to give the participants an opportunity to ask questions now, or just sort of reflect on what you heard and ask the questions later in chat. So it's up to you. Feel free to type it or raise your hand. So as you're all reflecting on the questions, I will slowly now turn to Bernhard, who's going to cover the technical element of these ransomware attacks and what he has seen and the way the Institute thinks about these technical elements, which we think are important to be highlighted in the reporting. Bernhard, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Klara, and also thank you very much, Roxana, for already pretty much laying the groundwork for my presentation. So actually, I do have a presentation prepared, so let me share that with you. Also, let me know if you can't see it. Okay, can you all see my screen?
Yes, all good.
Okay, perfect. So yes, so as Klara indicated, or actually as was kind of indicated in the banner in the beginning, initially Bruno was supposed to be joining us. Unfortunately, he can't make it, so I'll be filling his shoes, but his shoes are quite big to fill, so I'll give it my best shot. And the presentation will generally be, yes, about the technical aspects, but of course, ransomware isn't just ones and zeros, so it also includes other things, including considerations of impacts, as well as, for example, the enablers. Broadly speaking, my presentation will be divided into, well, let's say the first part, which will be very general. I'm not sure what let's say, the technical status is of all the participants. I think for some people, this will be very much a repetition, maybe a bit boring, but it'll be pretty much about what are the standard operating procedures of ransomware actors currently, or what they've been in the past. Then the second part will, of course, focus on, okay, what are the different techniques that are used, in the sense that ransomware isn't just ransomware. Oftentimes, there are many more aspects that can be part of a ransomware attack. And of course, each of these different aspects have different kind of impacts on victims. Then the third slide will focus on, let's say, the context of these attacks, because as I said, so ransomware attacks aren't just ones and zeros, they're not just technical, there is a context. And oftentimes I do think it's important to also take that context into consideration. And then the final aspect is also to consider the enablers. Oftentimes when you do certain kind of reporting on ransomware attacks, you read about, okay, the cybersecurity posture of the victim, but that's of course not the only thing that exists. There's also other aspects, other technologies, other factors within the whole context that kind of provide enablers to for these events to occur. So, okay, I'll start off with a brief description of ransomware attacks. Don't worry, the heading will be completed in a second. But first I'll say, so one change that we've seen in ransomware attacks these past 2 to 3 years is that they've gone to being very much self-spreading, to be human-operated. And what's meant with that is, so self-spreading ransomware is kind of like WannaCry or NotPetya. pretty much malware that spreads on its own. It's oftentimes called a worm-like malware. And the change that we've seen is now that actually it's become very much human operated, in the sense that it's groups of individuals that choose a target, that do the network infiltration, that do the compromise of the whole network, the deployment of the ransomware, and then do the negotiations. And just as a disclaimer, so in the presentation, and I think in most of the conversations that are currently being held, we're actually referring to human-operated ransomware operations. And I think that's maybe the first takeaway message that you can get is there are differences between, let's say, these less sophisticated kind of ransomware and these more sophisticated kind of ransomwares. And I think it's also very important for accountability later on. So yeah, kind of indicated in the first part. So the change has also been going from this more indiscriminate targeting. So again, ransomware that just spreads by itself, targeting any kind of victim, infecting individual devices, to becoming very targeted, very much focused on large organizations for various purposes. And then the final point is, okay, there's been much of a switch from, let's say, individual actors, organized groups or individual groups, as well as individuals that purchase ransomware packages to so-called affiliate programs. I'll explain in a second when I talk about double extortion, what that actually entails. But first, let me explain, let's say, the standards procedure during a ransomware attack. So again, as I mentioned, every ransomware attack is different, but this is, let's say, the standard blueprint. So of course, you have a threat actor who conducts an initial infiltration. Oftentimes that's done via phishing emails or remote desktop protocol compromises. Let's say those are the two most common infiltration vectors. Then once the threat actor is within the network, he or she or the group will start identifying files that are of value and encrypt those files. And of course, that can have different impacts. In this visualization, you actually see the impacts on a healthcare organization, because this visualization was taken directly from our report that we released roughly half a year ago on attacks against healthcare. And of course, the impacts can then, for example, be disruption of services, medical devices not functioning properly, a hospital not being able to take in new patients due to the medical record systems being down, and so on and so forth. And then depending on, back in the day, depending on if there are proper backup systems in place, and if those backup systems were also not compromised, the victim could either recover from the attack, both without paying the ransom, or they, of course, could pay the ransom, oftentimes in cryptocurrency, and hope that the threat actor does provide a recovery key. But either way, there is still an impact. There are still certain things that, certain time that it takes to recover from such attacks. So what has changed since then is something that's called double extortion. Double extortion is actually a rather new phenomenon. It started in November 2019, which, by the way, very much coincides with the COVID-19 pandemic. And it was kind of, let's say, pioneered by a threat actor called Maze. And this threat actor decided that they will not only just encrypt the files, but they also steal files that could be of value. And so if a victim doesn't pay the ransom, not only do those files stay encrypted, but they also leak those files by oftentimes dedicated dump sites or data leak sites, and of course thereby add let's say a next level of extortion. Of course, this is a lot more complex, so it's not only one individual doing it or one group doing it. It's oftentimes a whole network of groups, and which consists of usually a ransomware operator. These are the guys that give this ransomware, like Evil, Ryuk, Maze, Conti, the name, and then you have the affiliates, which can be from a handful to tens of affiliates, each conducting let's say different steps in the supply and in the attack chain. Usually the ransomware operator is in charge of maintaining the ransomware, maintaining let's say the data leak site, conducting the negotiations, while the affiliates actually are in charge of doing the initial infiltration, choosing targets, deploying the ransomware, and so on and so forth. And so this brings me to my next point. So now I point out, of course, a ransomware attack oftentimes, or what we refer to as ransomware, isn't just ransomware. Actually, most attacks that we see nowadays, they're double extortion. But these are not the only elements that you have in a ransomware attack. So you do have the encryption aspect, which of course is oftentimes the one that's the most disruptive, because it does disable systems, it does disable the access to files. And this, of course, very much depends on the victim. So if the victim is a hospital, I mentioned what the repercussions can be. I think Marietje touched up on it in the beginning. If it's producer of vaccines, it can mean that there's a stoppage in the production of vaccines. So again, it's very much victim dependent, and that's maybe something you should also consider when you're reporting on such attacks. Don't just look at the methods, but also, okay, what do these methods mean for the individual victim? Then indicated in the double extortion explanation, the second aspect that's oftentimes now part of such ransomware attacks are data leaks. And again, for different victims, this can mean very many different things. For the organization that's being targeted, actually oftentimes, this, of course, leads to reputational damage, but also leads to other repercussions, such as, for example, class action lawsuits. And of course, an organization that's already recovering from such an attack, maybe had to pay the ransom, who's already financially drained. Such a class action lawsuit is not exactly ideal. And what we've seen in the past is that oftentimes such organizations actually also do go bankrupt. We have witnessed a couple of such incidents, and yeah, well, that can be the repercussion for such organizations. But of course, there's also repercussions or impacts for the individual, let's say, data subjects whose data has been leaked. That can be from dangers of identity theft, further extortion, blackmailing, or of course also, let's say, psychological impacts. Then a third aspect we've often quite seen, and sometimes people have referred to it as triple extortion, which I think we don't want to go continue that chain and talk about triple, quadruple, and so on and so forth extortion. But it's also quite a common method are DDoS attacks. They're kind of, let's say, what in military terms you would call force amplifiers. So if the encryption aspect didn't work, if the leak aspect didn't work, and if the victim is not ready to negotiate, a third, let's say, pressure tool can be DDoS attacks, which are oftentimes then employed against the websites. And that pretty much implies that a victim will also not be able to, for example, communicate with the outside world via its websites, not be in touch with its patients, its clients, its whoever. I mean, maybe one prominent example to show how severe such an attack can be in terms of communication. I mean, most people in cybersecurity will be aware of the, let's say, DDoS attacks during the 2008 Russo-Georgian War, when all the government websites, all the media sites of Georgia were taken offline, meaning that Georgia couldn't communicate with the outside world. And of course, the only narrative that then came out was the one from Russia. Of course, that's on a very much bigger scale, but I just want to illustrate that they can be quite harmful, such attacks. Then I indicated slightly, so there can also be aspects of data subject extortion. Maybe to give an example, it's not a ransomware attack per se, but the Vastamo, let's say, data leak and also extortion of victims did have elements such an attack. So not only did the threat actor actually try to extort the target organization, but they also went to the individual, let's say, data subjects that were within the leak and tried to extort money from them. And it wasn't just any kind of patients; it was patients of a psychiatric clinic. So you can imagine what kind of impact that had on those individuals. Then another aspect that we've seen in let's say ransomware attack chains is, I call it media amplification here. I wouldn't know what the proper term for it would be, but oftentimes also ransomware actors, of course, if they want to shame a victim, they don't just put it in the dark web, but they can actually also contact journalists, they can contact media outlets, they can release the leaks, let's say more, let's say surface web outlets. In one instance, we saw actually a threat actor creating a Facebook advertisement for one of its victims. And of course, the intention here is to cause reputational damage. And also here, maybe as a journalist, you can always consider incidents where such a thing might happen with you, because of course you don't want to be part of the malicious activity. And finally, unfortunately, I can't see if it popped up, but there should be 3 dots, because in the end, anything that can belong to a ransomware attack, it's up to the imagination of the threat actor. And it's very much up to what kind of tools they have available and what the context offers, which brings me to my next slide, which is that context is very important. And the first context actually being that ransomware is just a tool. So we speak about ransomware as if it's a thing in itself, as if it's a phenomenon that just came out of nowhere. But actually, it's just an evolution in, let's say, cyber criminal activity that has taken place since over a decade. Right now, it's just currently the most successful extortion tool, we could say. In the past, some threat actors have, for example, threatened to use DDoS attacks against the victim. Of course, stealing data and then selling that data has been a way to make money as well. But currently, ransomware is just, let's say, the most successful tool in this regard. Although there have also been incidents where ransomware operators have actually said, okay, they're going out of the ransomware business and just going back into the selling of data business, or trying to extort victims just through the publishing of data. Then a second aspect about this tool, oftentimes the way it's referred in media is that it's cyber criminal, it's financial, but it's not always apolitical. And maybe if I can provide one example, which is maybe the most striking example, if you actually see the infrastructure of these threat actors, it's, well, first of all, I'll start off with the group that's called Pay2Key. And if you're familiar with geography, you might recognize the map of Israel right there with different dots on the map, which represent different cities, and a crosshair, so showing that, you know, cities in Israel, or Israel is in the crosshair of this threat actor. And this threat actor actually did in fact only target organizations within Israel, and all under the cover, of course, of being a cyber criminal actor. But clearly you can see, okay, in the worst case, or let's say in the best case, it's maybe an actor, a cyber criminal who does have, let's say, more political endeavors. In that case, you know, we could argue it's even a hacktivist. In the worst case, it's a government actor using, let's say, plausible deniability to cover malicious activities and cause chaos within Israel. And actually, this specific threat actor has been linked to an Iranian threat actor called Fox Kitten, which has been said to be state-backed and has been mainly conducting cyber espionage activities. So you do see that there may be more than just criminal activities or criminal intentions behind it. Let's say a more recent phenomenon, I think this one actually just popped up 1 or 2 weeks ago. It's called Moses Staff. And again, as shown in the picture, it primarily targets Israel. And yeah, also all the victims that it's had up until now have been Israel. And the talk has been very much about punishing that state. So maybe what you can do when you're looking at such ransomware incidents, do check the, let's say, the context, one specific context being the socio-political context, especially if you look at, for example, these attacks against Israel, which have, of course, not only been, you know, in one direction, that often also have been attacks against Iran, of course, but they do happen within the context, and it's not just zeros and ones, it's not just cyber. Actually, this kind of tit for tat has also taken place relating to Iranian and Israeli shipping. It has taken place within the context of Syria. It's taken place within the context of, let's say, a lot of surrounding areas and not just cyber, as I mentioned. Then a second aspect you might want to check, actually, which I could also actually talk a lot about, but I'll briefly talk about it, is the malware aspect. So oftentimes the malware of these threat actors it's also not apolitical in a way that, for example, some threat actors that have been believed to be based in Russia, or at least be Russian speaking, they specifically don't target Russian speaking keyboards or devices, as well as in some cases, even Syrian Arab speaking devices. So you can't even say, you know, it's just because of some, let's say, Cyrillic Brotherhood. It's actually more than that. It's actually, okay, allies of Russia. And that shows you that despite these threat actors oftentimes saying they are not geopolitical, it is very much geopolitical when it's not about targeting specific geographies. And which actually brings me to my next point. So you can also kind of check what these threat actors say. Oftentimes you can see that it's not only financial. They do speak about their love to their motherland. They do speak about more political topics as well. And finally, of course, you can look at the statistics and see what those numbers tell you as well. And I don't want to do shameless advertisement for ourselves, but we have released a platform, the CIT, recently, in which you can check and track those numbers, specifically in the context of attacks against healthcare organizations. So moving on to my next aspect, this is also something that you in the media should be quite aware of, is that ransomware is just a brand. So when you see these names, it's just a brand name, and it's actually their business model to promote that brand name, because of course, if, you know, successful attacks, a certain kind of, let's say, viciousness, or yeah, anything is linked to that brand name, it's very much in their favor. So when you report on these kind of things, just saying the ransomware, or just saying the name of the ransomware, you might actually be working in their favor. So what you might try to do instead is, for example, you might see it as an opportunity to actually maybe seek future accountability or tracking of these organizations, because oftentimes what you see is that these organizations are not just one brand. So either, for example, you do have things like rebranding. When things get too hot, oftentimes what they do is they go undercover, and then you see a new ransomware pop up with very similar, let's say, malware code, even identical data leak sites. And so maybe you kind of see their history and their tracking in that regard. What you also see is that these ransomware actors aren't all, distinct individual groups. I mean, they've even said themselves sometimes, they cooperate with one group, sometimes they work with the other group. And so maybe also checking that aspect. And of course, these ransomware operators do have activities and a history outside of ransomware. So let's say we take, for example, a specific ransomware operator. This ransomware operator could have also have a history in devising other malware. They could have actually had a botnet before, or actually be operating a botnet parallel to their ransomware. But the ransomware is just one brand and one web vector of their activities. So I do recommend also looking at those aspects. I did take this image from Krebs on Security, which I think is always quite a good source. I can't vouch for the links between these different ransomware operators, but what you do see is that there is an evolution between these different ransomware operators. And again, here it's just mapping ransomware or malware types, but actually it goes way beyond that. And finally, so one aspect you might also want to look at is, again, what are the enablers? So let's say one prominent enabler is, of course, how are these ransomware operators able to operate with, let's say, impunity? And we can say there are certain states that harbor these actors. I'm not going to go into details, but there have been states that have been highly accused within the media of turning a blind eye to these threat actors. If you look hard enough, you'll even find memes within the criminal community saying that you shouldn't target the hand that feeds you, and so on and so forth. So I mean, if you're seeking accountability, do look beyond the victim. The second aspect you might want to look at is the tech and platforms. And I know this is very vague, but also it kind of has to be vague in the sense that, again, every context of every attack is different. The prominent tech that's, of course, been talked about quite a lot is cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrency in the sense that it has enabled threat actors to transfer really an unlimited amount of money from a victim to a threat actor, something that previously was not possible without cryptocurrency. So you might also want to start questioning these kind of things that we otherwise, kind of take for granted. And with platforms, I don't want to point out any specific platforms. Of course, there are the darknet platforms that also, again, run with complete lack of oversight. But there's also, as I mentioned before, the use of, for example, social media to promote leaks as well. Then a second or third aspect that's often been talked about, cyber insurance. Personally, I'm not sure if a threat actor infiltrates a network and sees that the victim doesn't have cyber insurance, that'll deter them from not conducting that attack. In the end, what the threat actor has been saying, they know that if there is cyber insurance, they can request higher pay, but in the end, it will not prevent the attack to, let's say, to stop the cyber insurance model. Then finally, cybersecurity, as I mentioned, oftentimes it's really the easiest thing to focus on. What was the cybersecurity posture of the victim? Personally speaking, I think this is maybe the least inappropriate enabler to look at. I mean, in other security sectors, we do not, shame a victim for being targeted in cybersecurity for some reason. It is a common practice. So I do say maybe look at also other factors, other enablers that might otherwise be overlooked. But of course, and finally, what's the overarching theme here? And it's something that Roxana has touched upon quite a lot. It's the lack of accountability. And this is really what our institution has been trying to do. We've been trying to really, let's say, map the whole threat landscape, the whole sphere of actors, and see where accountability can be applied. And with that, I'd like to end my presentation. If you have any questions, do feel free to post them in the chat. And I'll pass it back on to Klara.
Thank you, Bernhard, for the presentation. I think there's a lot to unpack there, and then in case of interest, we'd be happy to share it. I just know there was a question before from Safa, I believe. So if anyone would like to come back with their question on the first part or the second part, there's an opportunity to do that now.
Hello.
Yes, we can hear you well. Thank you.
Yeah, much appreciated for this meeting. Thank you so much. I have a question about the first part. They mention the ransomware is still in the black box, especially in a country that the cybersecurity is not a priority. For example, here in the MENA region, So if you have information about that situation in the MENA region, it will be great for me. And also what we can do for the strategic plan for these countries, and regarding especially for non-profit organization that's working in human rights and activity. And thank you so much.
I think on the data, I can let sort of Bernhard say, our work has had certain, limitation depending on the project, but he can address the data. I think what, from my perspective, what can be done, it's very much what even Marietje said, these things have to be talked about and covered, constantly and in an informed way, because then it puts a certain pressure in writing those frameworks, in the way that decision makers, understand the equities they are deciding about. In various countries, there's different perspectives on national strategies and the way they are conceived. But we think that the key is to contextualize them and what the government is trying to do, in their national strategies, and connect it to their obligations under international law, or the things that they have signed up to or stated they will do, because then that recalls them to how to prioritize. Obviously, it's a space where there is a lot of competition, collaboration, and the governments are balancing very important national security, foreign policy, equities, with those others, prosperity, security. But I think through the work you and us and others in this space are doing, our key is to ensure that that the equity, the priority, are those human considerations. Bernhard, did you want to add anything?
Maybe specifically answering the question on attacks in the MENA region. Well, as Klara mentioned, so we are tracking attacks through our CIT platform, specifically in the healthcare sector, and we have noticed some attacks taking place, let's say in the Middle East, in Jordan, in Saudi Arabia, the UAE. But of course, there are certain limitations in collecting data. There are some countries that are better at reporting, or where there are, let's say, regulations that require the reporting of ransomware attacks, specifically, for example, speaking about the US. So there it's a lot easier to get data from. Same with the EU. Plus, of course, we've had some language, let's say, lack of language capabilities. But then again, you also have to look at the threat in itself. And okay, we can say ransomware is, let's say, the big topic in cybersecurity. But of course, you also have to look at it in different contexts. Threat actors, let's say, for example, the ones that have given the interview do say they, for example, very much like targeting the EU, because there are these GDPR considerations that if they leak the data, victims are more likely to pay. So of course, certain different threats are more prevalent depending on the regions, and yeah.
Thank you, Bernhard. Any other questions on anything you've heard so far? There's also an opportunity to just type them in the chat, and we'll answer them.